Hi there, welcome back to my channel if you've been here before. Welcome to the desk corner. In today's video, we are trying out another one of my new supplies that I got from one of my recent mini art hauls. And I actually have two mini art haul videos that I posted recently, so definitely check those out if you're interested in other supplies that I picked up. Well, one of the supplies I picked up was this Staedtler double-ended watercolor brush pens set, and it's a set of 36 pens. I was just curious about these. I hear that people enjoy using them and that they're really fun to use, and I love any type of watercolor product, so I thought that this would be really fun to try out. I'm also really into pens and markers these days. I think that that's what I'm leaning towards at the moment. So let's talk a little bit about these brush pens before we open them up. It's one of those flimsy packages that these come in, so I doubt I'm going to end up keeping them in this package. I'm probably going to keep them in some other type of pouch. Annoyingly, the typo store near me closed down recently, I think sometime this year or late last year, and that's where I used to get all of my art pouches, so I was so sad about that. On the back here is a small description. So it says that these are double-ended watercolor fiber tip pens with brush tip for beautiful watercolor effects on most watercolor papers. These are ideal for detailed sketching and illustration. The fine tip is kind of what drew me to these because they have the regular brush tip that most markers or pens do, and then you're able to get finer detail strokes as well. So that's what was interesting to me. It does say that they are like fiber brush tip pens, so I hope they don't wear down the surface of the paper. Let me just take one out so we can take a closer look just at one pen, if I can get it to focus. On the pen it just says Staedtler brush, and then it tells you which end is a brush tip and which end is a fine tip. Although I guess on the bigger brush tip end, the cap here is orange, and then there's this like orange part here, and then on this side there's a gray part, so I guess you could get used to that and remember which tip is which without having to look at it and read it. And so that's the size of the bigger brush pen. I'm wondering how sturdy of a brush it looks. It looks pretty sturdy just on first glance, so I guess we'll find out. That's the finer tip. That's pretty small, and so I'm interested how that's going to work as well. Sadly though, these don't actually have any numbers or color names correlating to the colors, so I'm glad I just got a 36 set because it'll be easier to tell which color I would like to use. Hopefully the caps are accurate, let's just hope. But if I had a bigger set, that might be more annoying as I'm searching and trying to find a certain color pen. I mean, with a smaller set, it's kind of obvious because all the colors are so different from one another, but there are a few that are kind of similar to one another. A couple of yellows here that might be a little similar. The rest of the colors look different enough to where it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So I did make a color swatch chart for these. Of course it's blank since there aren't any color names or anything like that, and it's wonky just like they always are. You know, I'm debating whether I should reorder them at all or not in order to swatch them, or maybe I should try to swatch them according to this chart down here. Before I swatched, I decided to add some extra rows in case I wanted to label or number these pens later. And then I started swatching, and I was treading carefully here, just swatching about half of the square and seeing how the water would blend out the rest. I have to say, I was using a water brush, and I don't think that was entirely necessary. I was under the impression that it might be harder to blend these out with water, but they didn't have any difficulty blending out with the water, and I could have used a smaller detail brush with less water to have more control over the pigments, which is what I would recommend after playing around with these a little bit. But you guys can see that they do act like watercolor, and you'll start to see that they get some watercolor-like effects. In the first row, the colors were bleeding into each other a bit because I didn't think to swatch every other color. I'll start doing that in the second row so we don't get any bleeding. The only color I had an issue with in the first row was this peach color. The water brush diluted it out way too much. Maybe that was my own error, but later I tried with a small watercolor detail brush and minimal water, and that worked out way better. This swatch chart was also taking me forever because since the pens are not labeled at all, I was trying to order them in the correct way, but sometimes the caps didn't really match the true color, and I was basing it off of the small swatch chart on the back of the plastic packaging. I don't think I made any big mistakes with it, and it turned out okay in the end, but it did take me a while, and I started to get frustrated with the lack of labels, especially with some of the caps, not all of the caps, but some of the caps not matching the true color. Now for the third row, some of the most beautiful colors in the set, in my opinion, were in this third row. Just look at how mesmerizing they are. Now I did have an issue with the third color. Just like the peach color in the top row, that third light blue color really diluted out too much with the water brush. I didn't have the same issue later when I used a small watercolor detail brush instead of a water brush. But on the swatch chart it looks rather sad. And now we're moving on to the last row. I was a little bit disappointed with the range of browns here. We do get a brown ochre, but the rest of the browns are really quite dark, deep, and intense. I was hoping to maybe have more of a variety, maybe another neutral or mid-tone brown rather than these really intense ones that we get. And now for a small blend test at the bottom, since I had some extra space and just couldn't resist. Look at how beautifully these colors blend together. They really are gorgeous to look at. Technically, you can get a bigger set of 72 if you wish, but you cannot replace pens open stock, unfortunately, which is a big downside to these pens. I also didn't see the 72 set readily available on Blick, at least as of October 2025, and I saw that they were in limited stock at other art stores as well. For me, the 36 set is plenty of colors. Time to put these pens to the test. I sketched out this elk on my Artbeak watercolor block. It's a cold pressed paper, and I was slightly worried about wearing down the tips of the pens with cold pressed paper. Maybe I'll try with hot pressed paper next time. With the fine tip, I filled in the eyes, and it's so fun to just be able to get that fine detail. The fine tip is really, really fine, and I think if you're working in a smaller sketchbook, you could even just use the fine tip alone for a more sketchy result and to get more detail but still get that watercolor effect. With the brush tip though, I think I went in a bit too heavy-handed. You don't need to lay down very much color at all, and I think I was just laying down way too much color. Especially with the more vibrant colors, such as this reddish brown color. This one is so intense. Another issue that I had with these was that a couple of the pens bled and leaked a little bit. I think it only happened with 2 of them, and it could have been because I was putting the caps on and off too fast or taking the caps on and off too fast. I'm not really sure, but it annoyed me that that happened with my first use, and I'm going to be more careful with them in the future, but I did end up getting some splatter on me. Unfortunately, it was on me and not the artwork. I think the splatter would have actually enhanced the artwork now that I'm thinking about it. I've definitely been honest in this video and shared some of my grievances about this set, especially the lack of identification labels on the colors, the flimsy packaging, and some of the bleeding issues that I ran into. However, I think I would still recommend this to most people given the very low price point. Right now, I saw that they were on sale for $23 USD, and I'm sure that the sales will continue throughout the holiday season. I bought them for about $25 or $26 USD for 36 pens, which is a really good deal considering Staedtler is a reputable artist brand that's well known. And considering the high price point of watercolor markers and pens, just look at the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer or the Winsor & Newton markers. I'm sure they're beautiful, but a lot of people don't want to shell out that amount of money. So I still recommend these watercolor pens. I think that they're gorgeous. The colors are really vibrant and blend beautifully. You just kind of have to practice with them. So as I'm working here on the elk's fur, I decided to try a more sketchy method where I sort of just added in some brush strokes and didn't blend them out fully. And you'll see me do that with the rest of the painting as I move down towards that in a moment. I think that you can do a lot of different techniques with these pens and practice with them in a sketchbook, and you would be surprised at some of the results that you would get, especially for a cheaper set of watercolor pens. So as you can see here, just adding in some very messy, scribbly brush strokes. The only issue I had was maybe adding too much of that deeper color at the bottom. which you'll see when I start to blend it out. It just becomes a little muddy and way too deep and dark. But I did like the results I was getting here. I also used the palette method a bit just to darken up some of the areas without scribbling further onto the elk. The palette method works fairly well, and I'm sure if you were wanting to mix colors, this would be the best way to do it as well. I then went to add some highlights with my Posca white marker, but I don't think this actually turned out too well. I was still able to get some white highlights, but not a lot. I was so annoyed with the lack of identification that I decided to just label these pens myself with a roll of tape and a micron. I did this very haphazardly. I labeled the colors numbers 1 through 36, and then I literally just cut squares out of the tape. Thinking back on it, I should have maybe cut longer pieces of tape to fully wrap around the marker, but I was just being a bit impatient here. I did have to actually swatch some of them out to make sure that I was numbering the correct colors. Some of the colors look fairly similar to one another, and just looking at the caps, it's really hard to tell. But I'm so glad that I labeled them, because this will be so much easier for me to use them in the future. I recommend that you do the same unless you end up buying a 12 set or something like that, or maybe even a 24 set, which might be pretty obvious which color is which, but anything bigger than that, I think you're going to have to label it for ease of use. I'm also using a detail watercolor brush here, and you can see that I have better control over the pigments as I blend them out. And that peach color turned out way better than it did on my original swatch chart. I also did not want to keep them in that flimsy plastic packaging. I found a bag that would fit the markers and the swatch chart just fine, and finally threw away that plastic awful packaging. I wasn't quite done yet though. I wanted to experiment and see just how light-handed I have to be if I want to get a more subtle result with these pens. I laid down just a few brush strokes with the brush side of the pen, and then used a small watercolor detail brush with minimal water to blend it out. As you can see, I can already get that fur effect just using a few small brush strokes. On the right side, I go in with a few thicker brush strokes and then blend that one out, and I get a much more intense result that might be a little bit too intense for my liking. Next, I did want to do a small comparison between these pens and some of my watercolor pencils. The first one being the Derwent Inktense. I only have the pencil version of that, by the way. I'm also going to compare it to my Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils and my Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle. The second swatch is the Staedtler pen, and you can see the difference that you're going to get with a watercolor marker / pen or brush pen versus a watercolor colored pencil, just for those of you guys that might be curious. And I know the reds don't entirely match, but I was working with what I had. And next I'm just playing around a little more with one of the more intense brown colors. Even when using a light hand, I sometimes felt like I was going too heavy-handed with these. I might even switch over to just using the fine tip for those really dark and deeper colors rather than using the brush tip. But I think that they fared way better using the smaller watercolor brush rather than a water brush, or using a bigger brush, which would be more loaded with water and therefore harder to control. Anyway, this is how my finished artwork turned out, and I actually really enjoyed playing around with these watercolor brush pens. Let me know if you guys have tried the Staedtler watercolor brush pens, what set you ended up getting, and what you think of them. I think that they're a really great deal for what they are, but of course I have some small issues with them. Some of the issues I think could be easily fixed by Staedtler if they wanted to fix them. But again, the price point is low, and these would work great in a sketchbook especially. So I had a lot of fun in this video talking about this product with you guys, and hopefully I will be using these and practicing more in the future because I clearly need some more practice. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. As always, definitely leave a like if you enjoyed the video, comment down below, and if you want to see more videos, of course, subscribe and check out some of the other products I've recently reviewed. I'm doing a lot of product reviews as we get toward holiday season and the end of the year here. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.